Hi all, this game video has been inspired by one of my amazing students, Peter Merrifield, who's making amazing progress tactically, and he wanted to go over some of the Fischer Spassky games in some of the coaching sessions we've had, and I thought a very interesting game from the 1972 match was in round 3. So the score at this point in round 3, it was 2-0 in Spassky's favour. Fischer had famously defaulted game 2, and many observers believed that the match was over. Fischer would leave Iceland, and indeed he was set to board the next plane out. He looked set, at least, to board the next plane out, only to be dissuaded by his second, William Lombardi. And also it might have been attributed to a phone call from Kissinger, Henry Kissinger, and a deluge of cablegrams. So anyway, sportingly, Spassky agreed to play this game in a small room backstage, out of the sight of the spectators. And according to Paul Benko and Bert Hochberg, the concession was a psychological mistake by Spassky. Let's see this game. So D4. I thought this game was very interesting in terms of especially the opening imbalances. So C4, we have E6. Now after knight F3, most modern super grandmasters, they play something quite solid. They play bishop b4 or d5. So here we see the Benoni actually, c5 being entered into after d5, e takes, c takes. So the heyday of the Benoni, the modern Benoni, was 1960 when Mikhail Tal became world champion. That was the peak popularity of this opening. We see d6, knight c3, g6. So now knight d2, this does seem to be a classic plan to target the d6 weakness. So quite often knight c4 and later bishop f4 is going to be targeting this potentially vulnerable d6 pawn. We see knight bd7, e4, bishop g7, bishop e2, both sides castle, rook e8, and now queen c2. This looks like a very logical move. There's no weakness of the last move, is there, associated with this? Or is it eyeing h5? Is there technically, it's possible to play this outrageous move? Surely Fischer would not play this, because surely there'll be doubled pawns there if knight h5. So here, indeed, guess what Fischer played? Is actually knight h5 possible? Would you consider doing it? If I gave you this position, would you really consider knight h5? It's actually what Fischer played. So it makes the game extremely interesting from my point of view for imbalances in the opening. So the favourable imbalances generally in the modern Benoni, we do have the 3-2 pawn majority. We do have the pressure on the e file. We do have a nice square on e5. But white has conversely potentially a nice manoeuvre to hit d6, potentially f4 and e5 at the right time because there's pawn majority over here for white. So it's interesting. This creates further imbalances, accepting double pawns. That is taken, and of course it weakens white a bit on the light squares to lose that light square bishop. Knight c4 hitting that d6 pawn, that's shielded, and hitting the knight. The knight goes to e3, which seems usefully also now to eye f5 anyway. So these splintered pawns, are they worth it? Queen h4. Now here is a critical moment in the game, and maybe a turning point of the match potentially if Fischer could try and get something from this game with the black pieces. He's never actually beaten Boris Spassky in a serious game before this game, so could he do it here? So queen h4, very, very aggressive, exploiting that knight's not on its usual default location f3, so it's eyeing h2, and this looks like a controversial move from Boris Spassky, missing the crude kind of threat or not trying to do something about it, perhaps because he didn't want to weaken some squares. He played bishop d2. It's a little bit controversial. If we look at this position, clearly g3 might be inviting knight f3 check, and this is really quite a dangerous position. And you might not think, well, how concretely? It's interesting actually. There's a very interesting variation here after a3, which you may never have seen before. Can you guess what black can do in this fascinating variation? So this is on the what if of 15 g3, which wasn't played. So instead of bishop d2. So guess what black can play here? This might be a secret variation you've never seen before. If you might have seen the game before, you might not have seen this variation. 5 seconds. Okay, it turns out there's bishop h3 check here. After king takes, knight g5. Now if the king steps back, then it's going to be mate time, and so that's not possible. And if the king steps forward, quite interestingly, I thought check. Black could actually do better than a perpetual check. Black can actually take on e4, check, knight g5, and then rook takes e3. This is really quite fascinating, taking out e3 for queen f3, so that now threatens g4 mate, because the knight was protecting g4. h3, h6 here, queen e2, queen f6, and the king is getting into real trouble. So for example like this, eventually after knight takes c3, bishop f6, check here, because knight takes took away the protection of the knight now, of protecting the queen, so that actually wins the queen if nothing else. So yeah, white would be in huge trouble on g3, it seems, for particular technical reasons. It looks visually you don't want to give the opportunity of a perpetual check to black anyway. But also here though, there does seem to be a viable idea in playing just f3, which would stop knight g4. If you look at this position, black does seem to be threatening the annoying knight g4 move to threaten mate. And if h3, well, maybe there's stuff after that. It's dangerous. So why wasn't f3 played just to secure down the g4 square? Well, maybe this is a symptom. Maybe Boris Spassky has been a little bit disturbed playing in this back room. Maybe. Speculation. But f3, potential downside of f3 is the f4 square seems ripe for a knight maneuver. Potentially, say rook f8, and here, and now knight g6 to try and get into f4, or play f5 at some point. But even more dangerous looking is an idea like bishop e5. But it turns out here, this compromised pawn structure does help white tactically with the move g3. There's a potential backfire here on the g file after bishop takes, knight f5, forking the queen and bishop, and if taking, that takes that piece away from the g file, and all of a sudden massive pin, end of game. So yeah, it seems as though f3 is actually, it seems to work even with those ideas of knight g6 and bishop e5. Yeah, that might have been a good improvement in this game. However, in the game bishop d2, and now we see this knight g4. Now this knight was taken undoubling the pawns, interestingly. On h3, knight takes, this position should be about even. Black has got quite a bit of counterplay here. For example, this position, using that lovely e5 square, there's a lot of pressure now on the f file. Black's got that bishop pair. It's quite nice for black. So okay, knight takes g4, mission accomplished, undoubling the pawns. So black still got the bishop pair, still got the original trump cards of the opening, the 3-2 pawn majority, the pressure on the e file, the lovely e5 square. The downside has been neutralized of d6 being a vulnerable piece. There's no knight to even go to c4 at the moment. Okay, there's knight b5 to factor in though at various points. Bishop f4. Okay, that does hit d6 as well. Queen f6. Now here is another very interesting decision point in this game after queen f6. First, if we look at bishop e5 as an alternative, white could take and play f4 potentially, and in fact g3 is a nice mechanism for protecting h2, and white ends up with a nice position, for example like this. there's lots of play for white. There's lots of weaknesses for black. So bishop e5 doesn't seem to do too well. And here, if g takes, rook takes, bishop g4, white ends up still doing very nicely. That f file seems particularly painful for black, and d6 drops off there. So yeah, queen f6 seems more flexible than bishop e5, less committal. So queen f6, interesting move, and it provoked actually what seems to be a controversial decision by Boris Spassky, g3, weakening the light squares. Why would he volunteer these weaknesses? Very interesting variations now. If bishop g3, you might think bishop g3. So h5 would actually threaten h4 to trap that bishop, and say f3, queen g6, let's say knight b5. h4 is actually possible here, because this would be a loose piece on d6 after bishop d7 hitting the knight, hitting that loose piece, so that would be actually winning material for black. So let's go back there and not take on d6 and try and do something more sensible. Here, let's say bishop takes h4. It turns out here, with the bishop leaving that g file, g takes, so that move g takes is illegal. This weakens e4, and it turns out taking on e4 now hits the bishop. And if here, then bishop g4, and black's got that run through the e file. So after knight takes d6, trying to distract the queen away from the rook, there's actually rook e1 check. So the pin backfire against the pinner there, winning the queen. So white has to be really careful here. But even this position, this is actually technically equal. It is a bit tricky, this whole variation. If white didn't want to lose the queen, but it does promise a technical equality, then bishop e5 hitting the rook, and bishop d7, that piece is dropping off. That's pretty nasty. This was a nice double attack on b5 and h4. So there are a lot of tricks here behind the scenes, it turns out, in this whole bishop g3. Superficially, if you read Wiki, I thought this is a very interesting variation. It sort of claims, g3 just weakening light squares and left it at that. So that's not the whole story. There is some controversy with bishop g3. It does create a fixed target, well, a kind of target for h4. So this move h5 is pretty dangerous to try and factor in. So all sorts of tricks emerge there, as you see. I thought this was really fascinating. So anyway, g3 was played instead of bishop g3. So yes, some squares weakened. Can we capitalize on that with black? Bishop d7, which does seem to prompt the idea of using the queenside pawn majority. So white puts a stop to that. b6. So sometimes white might want to play a5. This kind of dissuades it, because there's an option of b5 on a5 now, and also there's an option potentially of a6 and b5 later. As an example, if king h8, but this might just be equal here, this might just be even, it's not a big deal right now, but there's more flexibility for black in general. Rook fe1, a6, rook e2, and now b5 here, rook ae1, and now queen g6, so putting pressure on the pawn, slight pin there. b3, weakening some dark squares. On e5 here, then taking the queen off, and bishop takes e5, just gets material. Okay, and in fact, c4 as well is also good, potentially, because that majority of pawns is quite dangerous, and taking on a4, two good routes for black. So b3, rook e7, black prepares. Now this was hitting b5, so that's protected. A takes, and now a very interesting temporary pawn sack idea, which Fischer rejects with c4. He doesn't grab that pawn. So c4 puts some extra light square control, keeps a protected passed pawn here, and keeps this potential liability here. This pawn might be a liability later. If you compare this to c takes b4, knight a2, b3, this position, okay, black's got a passed pawn here, but it might actually be cheekily snapped up and it's an even position according to Stockfish. So okay, so c4 looks like a better practical decision. Rook b e8, after all the bishop's looking after the pawn. And now there's cash out time potentially with taking on e4. All of black's pieces, well, a lot of them rather, are geared up for this kind of transaction. We see now h5 though first. It does seem possible that bishop takes is possible here, but there are opportunities like bishop h6 threatening checkmate, which might be annoying. And this position, it is opposite coloured bishops, but black technically is doing very well. There are some maybe winning chances there. Okay, so here though, waiting on this transaction, bishop takes c3 to e4, because yes, e4 is a weak pawn here. With that g3 move, yes, there is controversy. It's not the light squares in their own right. It's necessarily it's the e4 pawn here, which can't be helped by its fellow pawns there with f3 in this position, so making this more painful. Rook 3 to e2, king h7, another waiting move. Maybe more and more calculations around this golden transaction of bishop takes c3 is emerging, until here, now Fischer decides to pounce. Bishop takes c3 here, rook takes e4. So, but isn't it going to be opposite coloured bishops after this heavy exchange transaction? We have bishop h6 threatening mate. On queen f6 here, there's check and bishop f5. And for example, this position is dangerous, more dangerous for white than black. So that would be, if that's the best move, that's not very good. Yeah, the form pawn is winning there. So we have bishop h6 instead of queen f6. Queen g6, bishop drops back. If the bishop had gone back to e3 instead, then check and f6, and black's getting a big advantage here. White's really tied down. So the bishop goes to c1, queen b1, king f1, bishop f5, making inroads on these light squares, and white's pinned up here. White's getting paralyzed. The king at least tries to unpin the bishop. Check, check. Queen b3, going for this weakness now, it seems. Queen d4, check, and the game ended here actually. If the game continued, so this is at move 42, life, universe and everything, if there was a move 42, queen takes b4 check, check, and b4, and black is winning, even though it's opposite coloured bishops. It's a winning position. The king can just come up the board, and that'll be winning for black. Okay, so I'll take you to the game end. So a big psychological win for Fischer there with the black pieces. And the reason I chose it out of all the games to start off with my good friend and student Peter, is I just thought the opening imbalances, if you look at them now from the modern Benoni, it's kind of outrageous. Well, the modern Benoni is rarely used now. Things do change. But the double pawns, he took a big risk. It did pay off. It did seem as though there is something structurally and to do with king safety about the double pawns, which meant that maybe f3 was a big innovation improvement in this game to stop black undoubling with knight g4. So, yeah, I thought there's some interesting behind-the-scenes variations. And some of the complexities around bishop g3 as opposed to g3, I thought we checked them out a bit here. So I thought it was quite fascinating to sometimes revisit these classic games from classic matches in the past. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, check out the bit.ly link there. Play me and other YouTubers. I'll invite you for a game if you register with that link. I'm playing hundreds of YouTubers at the moment. Or you can check the link in the description. Hope you enjoyed it. Okay. Thanks very much.